Our first keynote speaker was born, raised, and educated in Oakland and Berkeley. He's got his bachelor's degree in economics at UC Berkeley and his doctorate in economics from MIT. He currently holds the position of E.T. Grether Professor of Business and Public Policy at the Haas School at UC Berkeley. He has published extensively in energy issues, industry issues, and most recently on the economics of renewable energy, the economic policies related to reducing greenhouse gases and retail electricity pricing. He has a remarkable blend of academic achievement and public service. He currently serves as the chairman of the Petroleum Market Advisory Committee for the California Energy Commission, and previously on the Emissions Market Assessment Board for the California Air Resources Board. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Severin Borenstein.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. And that is a very nice introduction and very impressive that you did it with no notes. I wouldn't even try that. Thank you all for coming this morning. And I'm going to inviting me to give my perspective on fighting global climate change, which I think will in some ways be in sync with CCLs, but not in all ways. And I hope you will be at least open to some different perspectives. I want to emphasize fighting global climate change because it's important to be thinking about policies in terms of the entire planet emissions, not just California, not just Berkeley, not just the United States. As we go forward in the 21st century, most of the emissions are going to come from the developing world. So when we think about the problem of climate change, we have to think about solving it globally, because if we don't solve it globally, we just don't solve the problem. And so when I think about what should we be doing, a lot of what I'm focused on is whatever we're doing locally, how does that impact the global fight, and how does that help particularly the developing countries to move away from greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, it is important to price greenhouse gas emissions. Pricing greenhouse gas emissions harnesses the power of market incentives to move away from greenhouse gases, and I think that that is not always appreciated, but it is an incredibly powerful mechanism because, in the end, there are a lot of trade-offs that have to be made when we talk about fighting climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and having a centralized government make all those trade-offs really isn't going to work. There are some people who need big cars because they actually move a lot of stuff. And one-size-fits-all regulation really doesn't work when it comes to technology. Pricing greenhouse gases is a mechanism that allows people to recognize the damage they're doing by emitting greenhouse gases and to make adjustments in order to accommodate those damages. And if, when they do face the full cost of what they're doing, it's still worth driving a car that gets fairly low gas mileage, then they are at least recognizing that and making the right trade-off. When we talk about pricing emissions, there's a long time debate among economists and in the general public now, although it's been much longer among economists, between a carbon tax or a greenhouse gas tax and cap and trade. I've been sort of in the middle of this in the California debate, involved with the California Air Resources Board's program in cap and trade. I used to, if I had been giving this talk 5 years ago, been fairly neutral on cap and trade versus taxes. I'm not anymore. Having seen the California cap and trade program up close and studied the EU ETS and the RGGI systems, the other two big cap and trade programs, I'm a big fan of taxes. Good, that's one applause line. The reason, but the primary reason is because in the end, the way cap and trade would be implemented and has been implemented in California, it's not likely to be very effective, and I think it's actually likely to undermine the fight against greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason for that is the unpredictability of a cap and trade program. In the process of the work we did for the California Air Resources Board with my colleagues at Berkeley and Stanford, we wrote a couple of papers on the actual operation of cap and trade. And the main thing we found and showed in our work is that the biggest driver of the price in a cap and trade market is macroeconomic growth. So when California set its cap, and you can argue about when it was locked in, but let's say it was locked in around 2009 or 2010, there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen to the growth of the California economy over the next few years. You remember 2009 was a time of a lot of uncertainty. And it turns out California economy has grown fairly slowly since then. As a result, and that is the primary reason, we have emitted fairly low levels of greenhouse gases. As a result, going forward to the end of this current legislative program in 2020, we will almost certainly end up below the cap. Not because we've done it, not because the cap and trade program has been very effective. At $12 a ton, it's doing almost nothing, but because the macroeconomy has grown very slowly. That didn't necessarily have to happen. We could have run into a period like the late 1990s, the dot-com boom in California, or maybe what will be happening going forward, where the economy will pick up a lot. And then we could have had a very high level of emissions. But if you do the analysis of what's the chances we're going to be at a low price, a medium price, or a high price, what we found is there was a very high probability of a low price, some chance of a very high price if the economy took off, and almost no chance of a middle ground price. And the reason is the variation in greenhouse gas emissions due to growth in the macroeconomy swamps the response you're likely to get from a price of $30 a ton instead of $10 a ton. That is, this variation in things that have nothing to do with the price of carbon is much greater than the response you're going to get over the range of politically acceptable prices. And I will say, having talked to many people in the government, California has a price floor started at 10, it's now around $12 a ton. We had a price ceiling that started at 40 to 50. It's a soft price ceiling. It doesn't actually necessarily hold the price at that level. It's now up to sort of 50 to 60. But what we were told by people in all sides of the California economy was the price would never get that high. If we ever got close to that level, the program would almost certainly be altered or suspended. And so then you had to ask the question, well, what's a price in that range going to do? And the answer was, over the 8-year legislated length of this program, almost nothing. Compared to the macroeconomic fluctuations that we see regularly in the California economy. We have 20 years of data on California greenhouse gas emissions, and the variation even in those 20 years, which include the dot-com boom, the recession and the Great Recession in 2007, 8, 9, that variation is just massively larger than the response you're going to get from a price between $10 and $50. And so that's why the results of a cap and trade are very likely to be at the price floor, which is what we have seen in California, it's what we see in the EU ETS, and it's what we're seeing in RGGI. But it doesn't have to be that. If you actually had very strong economic growth, you could get the opposite result, which is a skyrocketing price. But in some ways, I think that would be worse, as much as I am completely comfortable with the $70, $80, or $90 price of carbon. I think that, and I've been told that politically that would almost certainly bring the demise of the program. And so that sort of shock, sudden fluctuation, I think is not the way to get to a carbon policy that's sustainable. So I think the tax is the preferable approach. It's far from perfect. One of the reasons is we really have no idea what the right tax is. People have sent me articles saying, well, this person shows the social cost of carbon is $40, this person shows the social cost of carbon is $20. With all due respect, we really don't have any idea. It's going to be driven very much by technology. So just to give you an example, if we were really running out of oil and gas, we are not. But if we were really running out of oil and gas and coal, which we're really not running out of, we wouldn't need much of a price on carbon at all, because we would, due to the market forces having nothing to do with carbon emissions, be getting off of greenhouse gas emissions. It would make solar and wind very economic. On the other hand, if we have massive breakthroughs in technology for extracting fossil fuels that make them very cheap, and that is what has happened, then we're going to need a much bigger price on carbon to actually put renewables and alternatives into the money. And so saying we know what the price of the appropriate tax is just nonsense. It's going to change as technology changes, and it's also going to change as we learn more about the science. As we learn more about what we really have to do. You know, you hear these things about this is what we have to do to keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. And then you talk to real scientists about it, and the real scientists will say, well, that's sort of the median estimate, and the variation is probably just as large as what I was just talking about the macroeconomic uncertainty. We're going to keep learning more, and so we are going to have to update our policy. And I think it is important, as much as it is important to get commitment to pricing carbon, it's also going to be important to recognize, to be upfront and say, this is where we are now. We're giving as much certainty as we can to the business world to adjust to this. But let's not kid ourselves and say we know this is the answer and we're committed to it for the next 20 years, because the world is going to change. And as the world changes, we may need a bigger tax or we may need a smaller tax, and we have to be able to be flexible. So even a tax is going to have flexibility when we think about how we go forward with a tax on carbon. So it was already mentioned today, what should we do with those tax revenues? Here's where the applause lines probably won't come fast. I am not a fan of cap and dividend or fee and dividend. I think actually that's not, and maybe politically that is where we have to go, because that's the only way we get it passed. But I think it is giving up a huge opportunity in 2 dimensions. One I will talk about in a few minutes, which is research and development and the extreme need for more research and development. But the other is, if the government has a pot of money, handing it to individuals on a per capita basis is just blowing an opportunity to eliminate a whole bunch of inefficiency we have in the economy right now through taxation. Every economist will tell you that using revenue of this sort to reduce distorting taxes would be far more valuable than redistributing it on a per capita basis. Now, we can argue about which distortionary taxes. I think we should be addressing both the economic distortion and the inequality distortions. And so a natural place to take those revenues and put them is in the reduction of payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are very regressive. By reducing them, we do 2 things. One is we redistribute income in a way that we really need to be doing. But the other is that we actually reduce the disincentive to hire people at lower wages. So right now we're having a big fight over minimum wage. Well, minimum wage is determined by the pay, but take-home pay is determined by the pay less the taxes. And those taxes, if you're at minimum wage, the primary tax you're paying is the payroll tax. And so if we could reduce the payroll tax, we actually raise the effective minimum wage for lower income workers, particularly. And so we reduce the distortion, reduce the disincentive that currently exists to hire lower wage workers. So I think that that's a much more effective way to use the revenue. I think that it would be a way to sell a carbon tax as not just a tax, but actually an economic stimulus, because it's reducing this great distortion we have in the economy right now. I am an economist, so I am not going to claim I know whether that's more politically or less politically feasible, but it seems like there's a pretty strong argument. Unfortunately, when we do get to, when I talked about what the right tax is, I think there is a lot of uncertainty, but I fear that the tax we're going to need is actually going to be pretty darn high. And I think this is, again, an argument for when we do try to implement such a tax, it will be easier if we can say we're going to use that revenue in a way that's actually going to boost the economy. Why do I think it's going to be high? Well, yesterday I was at the at UC Berkeley. The Berkeley Energy and Resources Collaborative had their annual energy summit. There's some really exciting stuff going on in renewable energy. Solar power has come massively down in price. Wind power has come massively down in price. I think that's great. What wasn't really pointed out as much at that conference is natural gas has come massively down in price. Hydraulic fracturing has made oil come massively down in price. It is true, renewable technologies are going to continue to march forward, but so are technologies for fossil fuels, because there's a lot of money to be made figuring out how to extract fossil fuels more cost effectively. And yes, we may be able to do something about that directly in the United States, but the rest of the world is probably less likely to hold back on figuring out those technologies. And now that those technologies have made real progress in the United States, they're being exported to the rest of the world. We're going to see more and cheaper oil and gas production. These are the new hydraulic fracturing technologies have really taken off in the US, and they haven't yet in China, for instance. And some people actually think this could be a plus in the medium run as China starts to tap its very extensive natural gas resources that are available through hydraulic fracturing. But in the longer run, we have to get off natural gas. The gain from natural gas is at best very incremental, the gain in greenhouse gases. The local health benefits from natural gas over what China does now would be massive. China is essentially poisoning a large part of the population burning coal, and natural gas would be a huge improvement over that. But the greenhouse gas and climate change implications are just a very incremental improvement. And so ultimately, the developing world, China, India, and even poorer countries that have access to a lot of coal have to move away from that. Unfortunately, the technologies for the cost of those technologies are also improving. And as they do, as I said earlier, the tax it will take to put renewables back in the money has to be larger. I hope that renewables will continue to get cheaper. We went through this amazing improvement in the last 5 years. The evidence in the last couple of years is not quite as heartening. Things seem to have flattened out a bit. But they have gotten a lot cheaper. And California has really been on the forefront of that. I think that's great. I don't think that's great for the reasons that usually get talked about. The fact that California has reduced our greenhouse gas footprint is pretty much irrelevant to climate change. California is a bit over 1% of world greenhouse gas emissions. If we reduce our emissions by 50% or 80%, it's really not going to make much difference. The reason I think it's great is because we have created new technologies, and what we're about to do is going to further lead the world in figuring out how to use those technologies. So California, as many of you probably know, is going to a renewable portfolio standard of 50% by 2030. I think that's a great thing, not because we're going to use a lot of renewable energy and reduce our greenhouse gas footprints. I think that's fine. But because we're going to run a grand experiment in the next 15 years, we're going to figure out how to integrate very high levels of intermittent renewable resources into a grid. And figuring out how to do that is going to be very challenging. This is what California is good at. That is the integrating new technologies. It may not go smoothly. I hope we're going to find out it's much easier than we think it is, but we may find out it's much harder. If we find out it's much harder, we're going to then have to work on the technologies to make that work more smoothly. That'll probably include storage. California is also pushing a storage mandate. I also think that's a good idea, not because it's going to reduce California's greenhouse gas emissions, but because ultimately we have to invent and figure out the way that the world, and particularly the developing world, can adopt these technologies in a cost-effective way. It is not going to work to tell the rest of the world you have to stay much poorer in order to reduce greenhouse gases. I think it's ethically bankrupt given the way we live, but I think it's just practically not going to happen. So I think ultimately we are going to have to invent those new technologies, because as much as I agree that we should be putting a price on carbon, putting a price of $100 a ton on carbon in India is just not going to happen. And I have actually been told that by the Indian climate negotiator. The guy who told me that was then fired a month later because apparently he wasn't supposed to tell people things like that. So that gets me to my last point, which is that ultimately most of what we should be doing has to be about research and development. Not in the just very small lab sense, although that should be part of it too, but in the broader experimentation sense. That is, how do we get to an economy and a system operation that integrates renewables, that reduces greenhouse gases at a very high level, without harming the economy? Because frankly, if the growth in the US economy flattens out or goes to zero over the next 20 years, we live pretty well. And it's really fundamentally not going to change the way we live. But when you look at the poor countries of the world, where people live on less than $1 a day and are trying to get to not even our standard of living, but a standard of living that's triple or quadruple their current level and still less than half of ours, it's really not going to work, and I think it's really not ethical to say you can't do that. So we need to figure out how can the entire world reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. Now, I know we're in Berkeley, but I think that challenge is so pressing that we have to be open to all the alternatives. Not that I am endorsing them, but I think nuclear power has to be on the table. I think carbon capture and sequestration from burning coal has to be on the table, and from burning gas. I don't think those are the leading contenders right now, particularly given the progress that solar and wind have made. But I think that we aren't sure, and we aren't sure what's going to work in other countries as well. And we have to be open-minded to all of those. Climate change is such a pressing challenge that we have to be willing to entertain all of those. At the same time, we do have to be pushing forward with wind technology, solar, some of the newer technology, wave technology, tidal power, and so forth. None of these is environmentally perfect. Anybody who has studied this knows the problems with wind power, the problems with solar panels, and so forth. And so we have to recognize that we have to be working on all of these things. And we have to be working on storage, because ultimately we are almost certainly going to have to electrify a larger part of the economy. There's enough gray hair in this room that I know many of you remember when an all-electric home for a while was a wonderful thing we were supposed to be doing, and then it was a horrible thing that we were moving away from to natural gas. And that now, as we go forward, it's once again thought to be the next thing. Not only electrifying our homes, but our vehicles as well. The only way we get there is with much better storage technology. Right now, by the way, electric vehicles have not only still are way behind the curve on the actual cost of producing the vehicle, and no, I am not talking about what you have to pay, the massively subsidized price, but the true cost, the very expensive batteries. They're actually more expensive to charge than buying gasoline at the pump. Gasoline is so cheap right now, it is actually cheaper per mile than driving your Leaf. So we really need to make progress on storage and on renewables in order to get those into the money, while still putting a price on carbon. Putting a price on carbon not just because ultimately we would like the world to put a price on carbon, but because in the intermediate run we need to put those incentives out that moves the market towards low carbon technologies. And so that's sort of my big picture view: pricing carbon, using the funds efficiently, partially to reduce the other tax distortions in the economy, and partially to fund research and development, recognizing that ultimately if we're going to solve this problem on a global basis, we need to have the technologies and the knowledge of for grid integration that the developing world can adopt, and when they do, they can move off greenhouse gases and fossil fuels as well. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much.